The Haitian Revolution, referred often as a world historical process in its own right, was a slave revolt that took place in what was then the French colony of Saint-Domingue. It culminated with the elimination of slavery and the founding of the Republic of Haiti. The Haitian Revolution is broadly known as the only slave uprising that led to the founding of an American state free from slavery and ruled by non-whites and former captives. With the increasing number of Haitian revolutionary studies in the last few decades, it has become clear that the event was a defining moment in the histories of the Atlantic world. The legacy of the revolution was that it challenged long-held Western beliefs about black inferiority and of the enslaved person's capacity to achieve and maintain freedom. The rebels' organizational capacity and tenacity under pressure became the source of stories that shocked and frightened the plurality of foreign readers. While acknowledging the cross-influences, most historians nowadays distinguish the Haitian Revolution from the French Revolution. Some even separate it from the mulattoes' earlier armed conflicts, which at first sought political rights for them, but not the abolition of slavery. These scholars show that if the agency of the enslaved blacks becomes the focus of studies, the revolution's opening and closing dates are certain. From this premise, the narrative began with the enslaved blacks' bid for freedom through armed struggle and concluded with their victory over slaving powers and the creation of an independent state. In April 1791, a massive black insurgency turned violently against the plantation system, setting a precedent of resistance to racial slavery. In cooperation with their former mulatto rivals, blacks ended the revolution in November of 1803 when they decidedly defeated the French at the Battle of Vertières. Although it is known as a single event under the name of Haitian Revolution, alternative views suggest that the entire affair was an assorted number of coincidental conflicts that ended with a fragile truce between mulattoes and blacks. The chief concern flutters around the question if the victorious Haitians were intrinsically a revolutionary force or not. One thing is sure, Haiti became an independent country on January 1, 1804, when the Council of Generals chose Jean-Jacques Dessalines to assume the office of Governor-General. One of the state's first significant documents was Dessalines' Liberty or Death speech, which circulated broadly in the foreign press. In it, the new head of state made the case for the new nation's coherent objective, the permanent abolition of slavery in Haiti. An independent government was created in Haiti, but the country's society remained deeply affected by patterns established under French colonial rule. Because many white planters had provided for the mixed-race children they had by African women, by giving them education and training and entree into the French military. The mulatto descendants who along with the wealthy freedmen had been orchestrators of the revolution became the elite of Haitian society after the war's end. Many of them had used their social capital to acquire wealth, and some already owned land. Some had identified more with the colonists than the slaves. The domination of politics and economics after the revolution created another two-caste society, as most Haitians were rural subsistence farmers. In addition, the nascent state's future was compromised in 1825 when France forced it to pay 150 million gold francs in reparations to French slaveholders, as a condition of French recognition and to end the nation's political and economic isolation. Though the amount of the reparations was reduced in 1838, Haiti was unable to finish paying off its debt until 1947, and the payments left the country's government deeply impoverished, causing instability. Background: many of the riches of the Caribbean depended on Europeans' taste for sugar, which plantation owners traded for provisions from North America and manufactured goods from European countries. The island also had extensive coffee, cocoa, indigo, and cotton plantations, but these were smaller and less profitable than the wealthy sugar plantations. Starting in the 1730s, French engineers constructed complex irrigation systems to increase sugarcane production. By the 1740s, Saint-Domingue, together with Jamaica, had become the main supplier of the world's sugar. Sugar production depended on extensive manual labor provided by enslaved Africans in the harsh Saint-Domingue colonial plantation economy. The white planters who derived their wealth from the sale of slave-produced sugar knew they were outnumbered by slaves by a factor of more than 10. They lived in fear of slave rebellion. White masters extensively used the threat of physical violence to maintain control and limit this possibility for slave rebellion. When slaves left the plantations or disobeyed their masters, they were subject to whipping, or to more extreme torture such as castration or burning, the punishment being both a personal lesson and a warning for other slaves. Louis XIV, the French king, passed the Code Noir in 1685 in an attempt to regulate such violence and the treatment of slaves in general in the colony. But masters openly and consistently broke the code, and local legislation reversed parts of it throughout the 18th century. In 1758, the white landowners began passing legislation restricting the rights of other groups of people until a rigid caste system was defined. Most historians have classified the people of the era into three groups. One was the white colonists, or Blankish. A second was the free blacks. These gens de couleur tended to be educated and literate, and they often served in the army or as administrators on plantations. Many were children of white planters and enslaved mothers. The males often received education or artisan training, sometimes received property from their fathers, and freedom. The third group, outnumbering the others by a ratio of 10 to 1, was made up of mostly African-born slaves. A high rate of mortality among them meant that planters continually had to import new slaves. This kept their culture more African and separate from other people on the island. Many plantations had large concentrations of slaves from a particular region of Africa, and it was therefore somewhat easier for these groups to maintain elements of their culture, religion, and language. This also separated new slaves from Africa from Creoles, who already had kin networks and often had more prestigious roles on plantations and more opportunities for emancipation. Most slaves spoke a patois of French and West African languages known as Creole, which was also used by native mulattoes and whites for communication with the workers. White colonists and black slaves frequently came into violent conflict. Many of these involved slaves who had escaped the plantations. Many runaway slaves, called maroons, hid on the margins of large plantations, living off the land and what they could steal from their former masters. Others fled to towns, to blend in with urban slaves and freed slaves who often concentrated in those areas. If caught, these runaway slaves would be severely and violently punished. However, some masters tolerated petty marriages, or short-term absences from plantations. Often, however, larger groups of runaway slaves lived in the woods away from control. They often conducted violent raids on the island's sugar and coffee plantations. Although the numbers in these bands grew large, they generally lacked the leadership and strategy to accomplish large-scale objectives. The first effective Maroon leader to emerge was the charismatic François Macandal, who succeeded in unifying the black resistance. A Haitian Vodou priest, Macandal inspired his people by drawing on African traditions and religions. He united the Maroon bands and also established a network of secret organizations among plantation slaves, leading a rebellion from 1751 through 1757. Although Macandal was captured by the French and burned at the stake in 1758, large armed Maroon bands persisted in raids and harassment after his death. Situation in 1789. Social stratification. In 1789, Saint-Domingue produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the world's sugar imported by France and Britain. The colony was the most profitable possession of the French Empire. Saint-Domingue was also the wealthiest and most prosperous colony, for the plantation owners at least, of all the colonies in the Caribbean. In 1789, whites numbered 32,000, mulattoes and free blacks, 28,000, and black slaves, an estimated 452,000. The lowest class of society was enslaved blacks, who outnumbered whites and free people of color by a margin of 10 to 1. The slave population on the island totaled almost half of the 1 million slaves in the Caribbean by 1789. Two-thirds were African-born, and they tended to be less submissive than those born in the Americas. The death rate in the Caribbean exceeded the birth rate, so imports of enslaved Africans were necessary to maintain the numbers required to work the plantations. The slave population declined at an annual rate of 2 to 5% due to overwork, inadequate food and shelter, insufficient clothing and medical care, and an imbalance between the sexes, with more men than women. Some slaves were of a Creole elite class of urban slaves and domestics, who worked as cooks, personal servants and artisans around the plantation house. This relatively privileged class was chiefly born in the Americas, while the underclass born in Africa labored hard, and more often than not, under abusive and brutal conditions. Among Saint-Domingue's 40,000 white colonials in 1789, European-born Frenchmen monopolized administrative posts. The sugar planters, the Grands Blancs, were chiefly minor aristocrats. Most returned to France as soon as possible, hoping to avoid the dreaded yellow fever, which regularly swept the colony. The lower-class whites, petty Blancs, included artisans, shopkeepers, slave dealers, overseers, and day laborers. Saint-Domingue's free people of color, the gens de couleur, numbered more than 28,000 by 1789. Around that time, colonial legislations, concerned with this growing and strengthening population, passed discriminatory laws that visibly differentiated these freedmen by dictating their clothing and where they could live. These laws also barred them from occupying many public offices. Many of these freedmen were also artisans and overseers, or domestic servants in the plantation houses. Le Cap Français, a northern port, had a large population of freed slaves, and these men would later become important leaders in the 1791 slave rebellion and later revolution. Regional conflicts, in addition to class and racial tension between whites, free people of color, and enslaved blacks. The country was polarized by regional rivalries between the North, South, and West. The North was the center of shipping and trading, and therefore had the largest French elite population. The Plaine du Nord on the northern shore of Saint-Domingue was the most fertile area with the largest sugar plantations. It was the area of most economic importance, especially as most of the colony's trade went through these ports. The largest and busiest port was Le Cap Français, the capital of French Saint-Domingue until 1751, when Port-au-Prince was made the capital. In this northern region, enslaved Africans lived in large groups of workers in relative isolation, separated from the rest of the colony by the high mountain range known as the Massif du Nord. These slaves would join with urban slaves from Le Cap to lead the 1791 rebellion, which began in this region. This area was the seat of power of the Grands Blancs, the rich white colonists who wanted greater autonomy for the colony, especially economically. The western province, however, grew significantly after the capital was relocated to Port-au-Prince in 1751, and the region became increasingly wealthy in the second half of the 18th century when irrigation projects allowed significant sugar plantation growth. The southern province lagged in population and wealth because it was geographically separated from the rest of the colony. However, this isolation allowed freed slaves to find profit in trade with British Jamaica, and they gained power and wealth here. In addition to these interregional tensions, there were conflicts between proponents of independence, those loyal to France, allies of Spain, and allies of Great Britain, who coveted control of the valuable colony. Impact of the French Revolution. In France, the majority of the Estates General, an advisory body to the king, constituted itself as the National Assembly, made radical changes in French laws, and on 26 August 1789, published the Declaration of the Rights of Man, declaring all men free and equal. The French Revolution shaped the course of the conflict in Saint-Domingue and was at first widely welcomed in the island. At first, wealthy whites saw it as an opportunity to gain independence from France, which would allow elite plantation owners to take control of the island and create trade regulations that would further their own wealth and power. There were so many twists and turns in the leadership in France, and there were so many complex events in Saint-Domingue, that various classes and parties changed their alignments many times. However, the Haitian Revolution quickly became a test of the ideology of the French Revolution, as it radicalized the slavery question and forced French leaders to recognize the full meaning of their revolution. The African population on the island began to hear of the agitation for independence by the rich European planters, the Grands Blancs, who had resented France's limitations on the island's foreign trade. The Africans mostly allied with the Royalists and the British, as they understood that if Saint-Domingue's independence were to be led by white slave masters, it would probably mean even harsher treatment and increased injustice for the African population. The plantation owners would be free to operate slavery as they pleased without the existing minimal accountability to their French peers. On 4 February 1794, under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre, the French Convention voted for the abolition of slavery. Robespierre is still revered by the poor of Haiti today. Center for Research on Globalization. Saint-Domingue's free people of color, most notably Julien Raymond, had been actively appealing to France for full civil equality with whites since the 1780s. Raymond used the French Revolution to make this the major colonial issue before the National Assembly of France. In October 1790, Vincent Oge Acute, another wealthy free man of color from the colony, returned home from Paris, where he had been working with Raymond, convinced that a law passed by the French Constituent Assembly gave full civil rights to wealthy men of color. Oge Acute demanded the right to vote. When the colonial governor refused, Oge Acute led a brief insurgency in the area around Cap Français. He was captured in early 1791, and brutally executed by being broken on the wheel, before being beheaded. Oge Acute was not fighting against slavery, but his treatment was cited by later slave rebels as one of the factors in the decision to rise up in August 1791 and resist treaties with the colonists. The conflict up to this point was between factions of whites, and between whites and free blacks. Enslaved blacks watched from the sidelines. Leading 18th-century French writer Count Mirabeau had once said the Saint-Domingue whites slept at the foot of Vesuvius, an indication of the grave threat they faced should the majority of slaves launch a sustained major uprising. Relationship between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Reason for revolution. The Haitian Revolution mirrored the French Revolution in the fact that it was a revolution ignited from below, by the underrepresented majority of the population. The lack of representation of the needs and opinions of the French Third Estate, the impoverished section of society, was the driving force for the French Revolution. A huge majority of the supporters of the Haitian Revolution were slaves and freed Africans that were treated unequally by society and the law. Economic disparities between the estates in France and racial issues in modern-day Haiti created an unsustainable social environment. Change was imminent for both societies. Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment is embodied in ideas of egalitarianism and rational change. These theories were highly applicable for the Third Estate, and they spread like wildfire from Europe to the Caribbean. Slaves. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen was partially a result of Enlightenment thinking and popularized the notion that men are born free with rights. Ideas presented in the Declaration in conjunction with French legislation stating that people of color are free if born to free parents initiated the thinking that all people, not only free, wealthy, white males, deserve freedom and certain rights. Brutality. Despite the idealist, rational and utopian thinking surrounding both uprisings, extreme brutality was a fundamental aspect of both uprisings. Besides initial cruelty that created the precarious conditions that bred the revolution, there was violence from both sides throughout the revolution. The period of violence during the French Revolution is known as the Reign of Terror. Those killed via guillotine, breaking at the wheel, or some other horrific death machines were perceived as adversaries to the revolution, and death toll estimates range from 18,000 to 40,000. Total casualties for the French Revolution are estimated at 2 million. In the Caribbean, total casualties totaled approximately 162,000. Violence in Haiti was largely characterized by military excursions, riots, the murder of slave owners, and guerrilla warfare. Lasting change. The revolution in Haiti did not wait on the revolution in France. The individuals in Haiti relied on no other resolution but their own. The call for modification of society was influenced by the revolution in France. But once the hope for change found a place in the hearts of the Haitian people, there was no stopping the radical reformation that was occurring. The Enlightenment ideals and the initiation of the French Revolution were enough to inspire the Haitian Revolution, which evolved into the most successful and comprehensive slave rebellion. Just as the French were successful in transforming their society, so were the Haitians. On April 4, 1792, the French National Assembly granted freedom to slaves in Haiti and the revolution culminated in 1804. Haiti was an independent nation solely of freed peoples. The activities of the revolutions sparked change across the world. France's transformation was most influential in Europe, and Haiti's influence spanned across every location that continued to practice slavery. John E. Bohr honors Haiti as home of the most influential revolution in history.